Did you know you can support Hugo's Desk in Patreon? Starting as low as $1 per month, your subscription to the channel will give you access to a lot of perks. For example, you can vote in my next video, or help me select the next topics of the channel. You'll have access to our growing Hugo's Desk community with a private Discord channel and a private Facebook group. You can even take part of our monthly Q&As and AMAs. By subscribing to my channel in Patreon, you're not only helping me keeping the channel alive, but you can help make Hugo's Desk better, bigger, and with even more content. And now, on to the video. Thank you so much.
My name is Hugo and welcome to Hugo's Desk. If you haven't seen the other parts of this video regarding pre-production, on-set filming, CG post-production, then please click on one of these links on the screen. In this section, I'm going to talk about the post-production from a 2D point of view. I'm going to showcase you the main composite in Nuke, the grading in Nuke Studio, all the many deliveries, and of course I want to show you the huge success of this project with all of the dozens of awards that it got so far.
Then we continue working in compositing. Our compositing team of Sebastian, Bjorn, and Justin and Kurti and myself, we continue comping. We had multiple versions. We had people running around quite fast. We then had versions with less people running around. We also had to composite the logo as well. I'm going to deconstruct this composite completely in Nuke, so you'll see a bit more about this very soon, so don't worry about that. But yeah, this was all the versions. Of course, like I said, you always do multiple versions with multiple color corrections and try to experiment and try to see, whenever you do things, like try to experiment a lot. We also had a multiple elements, from multiple websites of stock footage. We used Action VFX from stock footage. We used also VFX elements. We used Pond 5 as well. We had a lot of companies that contributed with a lot of high quality assets for this project. And yet another version, and yet another version. Almost done. Yet another version of the same comp. There was a phase where we had some ashes going in the air. We abandoned this idea and we actually used these ashes on the final shot instead. A bit closer to the final version, of course, still some tweaks. We also had a moment where we had debris flying through the camera. And this was the final version. Of course, this is the final version without grading. So this is raw from Nuke. As you can see, no, sorry, this was not the final version. This actually is a version where we had some lines and some, the typical Saving Private Ryan effect, which we took out because it was a bit too obvious that we were doing Saving Private Ryan. We actually took it out using, this was of course achieved using a glint effect inside of Nuke. So like I said, we have two different comps. We have the comp, which is the grade version. That's version 65. And then we have version 54, which is the actual comp before the grade. Of course, they do not match because we did some adjustments on the grade. I'll show what I mean. This is the actual final comp that was made. And then inside the grade script, it became this. So we did a lot of adjustments in terms of grade. And also we added more things as well. Let's go through this script here. I know it's very big, but I'll try to be as quick as I can. I'm going to start actually by just showing you something I haven't shown you yet, which is the actual matte painting. So this is a matte painting set up by, let's see here, where is it? It's here. So this matte painting was actually created by David Gibson, which is a very talented matte painter. We had basically a sky. We then had some layers of the city. This was all done in Photoshop. We also have the terrain, which is the desert. Of course, we start with the sky, gets merged with the city, gets merged with the terrain. Then there's a bit of a denoise because there was a bit of too much noise on the photo. There's a sharpen as well, high pass, which is a gizmo to do sharpening. This saturation for a little bit in a roto shape, especially the sky here, because it was really conflicting with the explosion. A bit of a color correction to make it a bit more blue. Some transforms, some reformatting, of course, and then that gets merged. A bit of desaturation, a bit more grade, especially on this side here, to make it a bit more moody. There's another grade, and this is using a radial, so it's almost like a vignette. Then another subtle grade going on here, a bit of a glow in the middle section, and then another grade toning down the middle. Reason toning down the middle is so that we can put the explosion. The result was a render. We pre-comped and pre-rendered that sky, and it gets merged with the explosion. So the explosion to start off is what you saw in the script just before. So this is the main explosion that was comped by 1, just this section. Then there's basically a little section that is added in the middle here. So as you can see here, there's more on the side there. That's just like a little patch that was made. Then it goes into the background. So basically we unpremult it, we then grade it a little bit to fit it into the matte painting. We then grade it even more, put a bit of a glow, so we have a glow in the inner explosion. This glow is driven by a very middle ground tolerance and some brightness with a size of 10. That gives you like this kind of like really nice glowy diffuse, just to show you that. Then we have another glow. This is a larger glow. It's a 100 glow with a bit less tolerance of 100, and then it gets merged on top. So you see that's the original and that's the diffused one. Basically just gives a bit of diffuse, almost looks like it's a sunny day on a desert, you know. That then gets merged. We pre-multiply it, we sharpen it using a log-to-lin, so the sharpening becomes better. That also gets pre-rendered. Like I said, because we wanted to grade and wanted to keep the comp alive, we actually ended up rendering this section because it was so slow because of all these glows. And so then in here, it's finally the moment we merge both. So we have the matte painting from David, and then we have the bomb from One Brockhouse, and they get, of course, merged together so that you get this, the merging of the two things. We then edge blur a little bit the CG. There's a light wrapping going on. This light wrap is quite an extreme light wrap. We have a diffusing of 220, density of only 3 to just give you this diffusing from the background. And that gets merged as a screen operation just to give you this dusty diffusing going on the explosion. From there, we have a bit of a lift that's happening with a ramp here. We use a ramp to just color correct this section. So basically it just lifts it up the area that it looks a bit more foggy in this area. And then there's another one that makes it more dusty. Basically to try to put these two fogs or literally just a lift. Both of them are using the lift operation with a bit of a yellow and a red tint with the ramp. Again, it's basically a poor man's fog just to make it look like it's lifting up the dust particles from the floor. Now, in here we have the debris. This is the debris bomb. This is a render. I'm just going to play this back. These are basically just particles of debris floating around the explosion. It's almost like a twister of explosions, and this was done also in Nuke. So as you can see, this is the ash particle system that was done inside of Nuke. This is the render, of course. It's called Debris Bomb version 4. I'm going to just go ahead really quickly here and show you how this works. So these are two particle systems that were made for this scene. They were made by one of our compositors, from Justin, and also I think Juan. I can't remember. I think it was Justin and Juan, but I believe it was Justin that created this. So basically, I have, we have a piece of element here, which is some floating dust particles. I believe this is from Pond 5, the element. This then goes into several frame holds. These frame holds, of course, or basically just frame holding the scene so we don't have to process it too much. It's a bit of a roto shape here. So as you can see here, several types of debris gets rotoed. So these are like real, as much as I try to use the particle system in Nuke, it's always a good advice to use real stuff. So these are real particles that you see in from the footage. And then they go into a particle emitter. Now the emitter is basically plugged in with all these particle inputs, because you can put as many particle inputs as you want. And then there's a card driving it. So I'm going to just show you this on the 3D system. It takes a bit of time to load. If you give it a second, you'll see it. I'm going to open up the particle emitter to show you here. Go to full screen. So this is the particle system. It's basically being driven by a card. And this is how the particle looks like. Basically, it has a starting point at 500, an emission of 0.5, a threshold of 0.5. Maximum life is 2100. There are some velocity settings, some change in terms of the rotation, so it kind of starts rotating. The spread is also 0.475, and this kind of gives you the particle system. I don't believe this plays back inside 3D system. Often the 3D system of Nuke is very slow, so I don't think it will play back. So as I expected, it did crash. Just going to show you the actual render of that. So you saw it on the 3D system just now. I'm just going to see if I can at least show you again. So this was being driven by a card. Just going to... Yeah, okay, so it's still cached. That's good. So this is driven by this card here. So this card, of course, is the roof where the particles are falling from. And then that's the emission. And now, after that, there is a couple of transform geos here, just to make it look like it's more thick. So this is literally just multiplying that single particle system into multiple particle systems, so that you can kind of see it going through. This, of course, it gets rendered, gets processed by the scanline render. In the scanline render, so this is the default view from the 3D system. If I go to 2D, that's how it looks. There is an SD map here. So this is the SD map from the lens grid. We shot the whole project with an 18mm and the 6K resolution of wide aspect ratio on the red camera. So this is an SD map from the lens distortion node. Gets SD mapped. Of course, that gets bulged in the scene here. We did do some transforms because to match the CG, but if you couldn't do some transforms, you see there's some stretching of the pixels here. That is very easily fixed by just putting an overscan. So if I just set an overscan perhaps to 20, I think maybe that would probably be enough. Maybe it needs to be more. Yeah, I think it needs to be more. It's quite big, the 18mm, so I'm gonna just go ahead and do that. There we go. Now that's probably too much now. It was just a bit slow to show it. So the overscan, of course, gives you that extra pixel so that then it doesn't get cropped by the lens distortion, because of course the lens distortion is giving you the bowing of the lens, especially because it's an 18mm lens, which is quite aggressive. We did do some transform and some cropping. We then rendered it, and this is some hash that we put up. So you can see this is just hash falling down through the sky. We didn't use it so visible. We actually toned it down quite a lot on the scene. I even think that there was a version where we didn't even have the hash. So let's go back to the comp itself. So that was the hash. We basically graded the hash a bit so that it would have... So sorry, this is the debris. I'm now confusing myself. So that was the ash, but also we had the debris on this side. So the debris was made by actual photos of debris. So it was actually made from photos of debris. This was keyed, so we could key out the white. This is literally a photo from Google of wood debris. This gets pre-multiplied, and we have several pieces of debris, as you can see here, that were rotoscoped using... They got pre-multiplied and cropped as well. And then they go into a similar particle system. So if I go to the particle system here, you can kind of see the particle system is made out of all these pieces of rock and debris and all these things floating in the middle of the air. They then get into a particle vortex. The vortex allows you to rotate, basically just like the name says, it's a vortex. Then it gets transformed to become much smaller as well. And then that gets, of course, again, ST mapped in terms of... I'm just going to go to the end here because then you can see more particles. Just give me a second. As you can see here now, you can see more of the vortex. I'm just going to go back to the particle emitter here and show you. Okay, so that's the vortex particle emitter with all those little stones and pieces of wood, as you can see. That's kind of a vortex effect. Of course, if you view it through the camera's perspective, it kind of looks like that. And then this gets, of course, SD mapped, transformed, and rendered. And the render then looks like this. The same exact render you saw here. Now, this was color corrected. We had a bit of a vector blur to blur it. Then this was pre-rendered again because the vector blur is quite heavy. And then that was comped on the scene. So remember, we were here, and now we merged the vortex. Now, the vortex is very subtle, as you can see, but it's just enough to have more particles flying through the air. Very subtle indeed. Then from here, we go into the explosions in the background. Now, let me just decide here if we're going to go for the CG. Yeah, let's go to the explosions for the background. Let's do this layer by layer. The explosions in the background that basically look like this. I know this doesn't look like much if you look at it. Basically, we have explosions on this side, explosions on that side. By the end of it, we just have a bunch of explosions happening everywhere. Now, this is coming off from stock footage. So we have explosion blasts. We have another explosion here. We have some more fiery explosions, some more fires. We even have even more fires here and more smoke explosions. They all went into a 3D system in cards. So this was, of course, placed in the correct place on the geometry. We used the geometry of Nuke to place the stuff. That got rendered. And this is how we have it. So we have several explosions in different locations. Blur it a little bit because it was a bit too soft. We then added an unpremultiply and a premult, of course. And this gave us the fog, which gave it a bit more image. Now from here, this is a mask input. So we have a color corrector here. And you see there's a mask input coming to this grade, which gets cut by all the elements. That is coming, of course, from the CG, which we haven't talked about just yet. So if I follow this line here, it goes through here. So that's the CG of the actual, and what we're using is we're using the alpha channel. We're going to talk about the CG in a minute. But that masks the explosion. So the explosion, then we do a premult. And so now the explosions are happening behind the cars and behind the explosions and behind everything else. Then there's a bit of a glow happening on top. Let's just go back here. This, of course, gets merged on top of the explosion. So we started with just the point cloud in the atmosphere, in the atomic bomb. We then graded the placing for the explosions a bit. We screened them on top. The reason we put a grade is because otherwise it gets a bit semi-transparent. It doesn't get really very good. It doesn't look very good. And then, of course, this gets merged on top of the CG. So these explosions are basically layers in between the CG and on between. And as you can see here, they merge quite well. This explosion, for example, here merges really well with the Houdini scenes. And this is nothing more than just doing good color correction between them, you know, so that the black point and the white point match. That's the whole point. Now, before I merge the CG here, I want to go through the CG myself as well to show you what's going on here. So we have two different setups of CG because we first rendered from Redshift, we rendered the CG itself. So I'm going to go to the last frame here, which has the tanks and the Humvees and everything. We then later on, after some feedback, we actually rendered some crates as well. These crates came from the game itself. So these are assets from the game. So that's why we have it separate here, because it had to be rendered separately because we already had all the renders made by then. I'm going to just gamma up this a little bit so I can show you things normally. So this is everything that I showed you before on the last video. We have the beauty. And then I do what I usually do on my videos. As you can see here, I shuffle everything in. The reason I shuffle everything in is because I want all these EXRs to actually be inside the stream so I can use them for color correction and so what. So we have a fake window reflection. We have, of course, the global illumination GI. We have the diffuse filter. Then we have the refractions, the reflections, specular lighting. There's a diffuse pass here that is not used. We have some emission, which is not used on the scene. Diffuse lighting as well. Now it gets merged all inside, and now you can see I have all my layers here, just like if this was an EXR. Reason it wasn't an EXR with all the passes is because we wanted to save. You get a lot of bad performance if you're using a network environment with a lot of layers, so that's why we use that. We also have the fog pass, which is something you saw on this third video as well. So we have red channel, green channel, and blue channel, and these are the different anti-laced fog passes we used. We also have, of course, the actual depth pass. We have some normals passes, we have some world position pass, and we have some utility passes, which include the M and occlusion at the moment. They'd all go in. We also did not have Cryptomat back then, so this was not done with Cryptomat. We have object IDs A, object IDs B, object ID C that was not rendered actually. And that all goes in, and as you can see, we have every single layer we need for this thing. Now in here, we have the 3D system. I always usually have the 3D system just so I can know where things should be. Just so that I can kind of see it if I need to. And then in here, the rebuild. So we have the GI. Then we have basically the GI. We added some multiplication to it so that it was a bit more bouncy. So we had more bounce of light. Then we have the raw light. So this is basically the diffuse light and the actual diffuse. I unpremult both of them. Then I divide them so that is now the raw lighting. So by dividing the diffuse lighting, which is of course the multiplication of the diffuse together with the direct lighting, by dividing the diffuse by the diffuse lighting, you basically get the original lighting. So that way you can control the lighting if you would wish. We ended up not doing it, but if you wanted to, you would have put some color correctors here to fix the lighting. Then we actually multiply it by its light. And this again, like I said, it would have been color corrections would have done. This was made just in case we needed to. There's some object IDs being used for the saturation, some color corrections done just for the Humvees and for the actual trucks. We then have a color correction for the wheels because the wheels were a bit too dark. Of course, all these color corrections don't make a lot of sense when you're looking at through this viewer here, but don't forget that you usually do these color corrections while looking at the final result. That's the objective. You see the final result and then you adjust it accordingly. And back then I thought that the tires were too dark. And in fact, I can show you what I mean. If I go to the end of the comp, just go to the end of the comp, and if I disable those color correctors, I'll show you exactly what I mean. So if I disable all these color correctors first, it's going to take a little bit of time to show up. So you can kind of see that this ID, for example, here, it basically bounces back the Jeeps here. It just helps the Jeep to become a bit more visible. And then, like I said, we also have an ID that allows you to light up the tires as well. It's very subtle. It's all very subtle. So it's very difficult for you to notice. But let's just continue here. I'm going to gamma this up. It's very subtle because I'm watching it on my actual 10-bit display grading monitor. So I can see it much, much better here. We then have a refraction. We did grade the refraction a little bit. We actually had also the reflection glass here that we used as a grade node here to actually refract less. That was plus together. So, and then we have the actual reflection. We graded the reflection a little bit. We graded the reflection with a bit of a mask as well. And then we masked and placed it on top. And here we have the specular light, a bit of grading on the specular light because it was a bit too less strong. So we've pumped up the specular light, reduced the specular light on the window here because we were having some artifacts. And then we did an overall color correction, very subtle color correction for the specular. Specular got into the scene. And then last but not least, the emission. So as you can see here, we basically started with the global illumination. Then we placed the lighting on top. Then we placed the refraction on top, and then we placed the reflection on top. Then we placed the specular lights on top, and then the emission on top, and that was done. Now, we also have a couple of things done here. So we forgot to put the Humvees logo here of the game. So this is the logo from Homefront The Revolution. So the way that we did it here is that we've picked up the logo, which was from a PDF from the client. We then graded it, defocused it, and projected it into the geometry of the Humvee. So I'm just going to show you how that works. A door here, which is basically the geometry of the actual Humvee. And then we use a projector, a camera to project I'm just going to show you the actual projection. So that's what you get. I'm just going to gamma up so you can kind of see it. So by projecting it, of course, you get the actual bending of the geometry, and otherwise it wouldn't look like that. It would basically be just a top perspective. We did the same thing as well for the American flag. The American flag was also projected in a card, so we can place it in. So we then started having the unv in here. We then merged the projected logo in here. Should have been projected really on the diffuse, but it doesn't really matter. And then the American flag, which is down here, which is a little 2D card. From there, then we have some color correction global to the layer. So using the object IDs and channel merge and basically channel merging it to get just the Humvee on the front, we got a grade node. So we lifted up that Humvee. We then lifted up even more with a radial. The radial was basically just the middle section, because the reason we did that was because we wanted to see the logo a bit more. And then we have a shuffling of the reflection. We desaturate the reflection, gamma down the reflection, color correct the reflection, then plus it on top, so that the reflection is a bit more toned down on the windows and on the glass as well. Then from here, we basically have a bunch of stuff. So this is a shadow for a shadow done with a projection, really. And I'll show you exactly what I mean here. So we wanted, the client has basically requested to have a bit more darkness in the middle here. And we didn't really want to do this in 3D. So this is just like a darker area in the middle. So this was done in the 3D system of Nuke using a projector with a card. So basically what you have here is this. You have this mask here, which is attached to a card. And then this becomes a black and white image inside the scanline render. And it looks like that. That's the basic shape that we have here. Now, of course, we use the object ID, channel merged only the objects we didn't want to affect, and then channel merge against them. So that means that we basically stenciled the alpha channels of the object with the floor mask, and that, of course, gave us that darkness that we wanted. It's almost like doing a grade in 3D. Now, these days, I would use a PMAT node for something like this, so I wouldn't probably use this. We also have some shadows that were made using, again, the 3D system. So these shadows was actually added here. These were shadows for the crates that we're going to add later. Again, they were done using the 3D system. And then we have some contact shadows as well for the characters as well. You don't really see them here anymore because they are not almost visible on the screen, but it's very subtle. Then we have some color correction, which is the haziness of the atmospherics. So more color correction to remove the saturation, make it look better. Then, of course, we have a render here. So basically pre-rendered this, and this is called the CG No Fog. And the result of it is this CG. Now, this CG was rendered with just some of the layers we needed. So to save space in EXR and also to save processing time, I removed the diffuse lighting. All the AOVs were removed from the script, so that we basically, this EXR was only rendering the object IDs and the fogs that we actually needed. So this was brought into the scene again. And now we start doing the fog. Now the fog is done on several stages. I'm just going to move this a bit bigger here so you can see it. So we have the normal fog and we have the Y fog. So like I said, I rendered the CG with the fog passes. So we shuffle out the fog. We then color correct the fog, so it's a bit more color corrected. This is literally just playing around with the black point and the white point. We then use this as an alpha channel into a lift. So now this is the first lift we put. This is the normal fog, and it's the yellowish dirt fog that we have. Then we have a bit more extreme fog. So this was the first fog, and that was the second fog. And that again is a lifted, and that's only to affect the really far away part. So if one mask was looking like that, the other mask was looking like this. So basically, it's basically in here it affects almost the whole image, and in here it affects just the background. So that gives you a dusty fog and then a really extreme fog on the back there. Then we have the Y fog. The Y fog was shuffled out. We then color corrected the Y fog, so it was just on the surface, and then that was a lift, and this gave you just this atmospheric just on the bottom area here to really fill in the fogginess. And so that worked really well. As you can see, we have the normal layer, then we have the fog, then we have the more extreme fog on the back, then we have the Y fog, and that works really well. We then shuffled in the original alpha so we can pre-multiply this. We pre-multiplied it with the actual fog as well. And now this gets merged with the crates. Now the crates were done exactly the same way. I don't need to show you everything we did with the crates. So basically it's the same process. We shuffled everything into the stream. We merged it. We did a bit of color correction on the refraction. We did nothing else anywhere else. We did some color correction to balance the crates so that the crates would feel like they were part of this scene. We did add some fog into it as well, render this out, and then basically we merged it. It was merged on top here, so now the crates are part of the CG as well. From there, then we used the actual depth of field. Now, we ended up not doing depth of field, actually. We had depth of field in the beginning. There was an idea of putting a bit of depth of field, but we ended up not rendering it, actually, feeling that this was a bit too extreme. You see here, if I would have had this kind of type of depth of field, you see here the back antenna was already blurred. So that means that my nuclear explosion would have to be extremely blurred. And I kind of felt that that was a bad idea, so we didn't use it. So we did not put any depth of field on the scene. It turned out much better. We have some post blooms and glints here. They were done by an enormous amount of shuffling going on here with the object IDs being shuffled so that we could just have certain areas of the scenes. We unpremulted the shot, edge blurred it certain parts, then premulted, then merged it over. Finally, we get back to the matte painting. So this was the matte painting. Remember, we merged the fires, and then we merged the CG. Now the CG, light wrapped, of course, we have two level light wraps. We have a intensity of 18 with 100 diffuse to give you that general feeling of light wrapping. And then we have a less extreme light wrap. Now, they both get merged with a bit of a color correction, and there's two screens on top there. And then what else do we do here? Then we finally put some glint. Now, the glint is very subtle. It's basically using a glint operation from the explosion, defocusing it a little bit, color correcting it a little bit. Then there's a second glint, which is the bottom reflection explosion. They get merged on top. We do a bit of color correction on top, and then it gets merged on top as a screen. And as you can see, it's a very subtle effect that we have here. This is very common effect that you saw in films like Saving Private Ryan or even like Full Metal Jacket, and it's done by using lenses, of course, but we're using a glint operation here to make it work. Then from here, we have the CG done, and now we start putting people in. So now we're going to start putting people one by one. So that's the full CG done there. Now we start, as you can see here, this is a grade node, and you can saw that it affects just that area here. These are the footsteps of people. So they are, of course, using an alpha channel that comes from, of course, the soldiers. And then there's a grade node with a multiplication to make the shadows. Now this is made by using a 3D system. We faked it by using the edges here and basically doing this. Now I'm going to, before I do this, I'm going to actually go into the plates themselves first. So this entire section here is the section of the siege of the green screen. And so this green screen, which you saw on the pre-comp, was all split up. So as you can see here, we have the main, which is the pre-comp of the main characters on the shot. And then, of course, we have every single individual plate as well, rendered and imported already as an EXR. Now, they all have their own color correction. So let's start with, see here. So we have B-roll, gun, model, just a second. So let's start with the main guy here. So I'm going to go to the last frame. Basically, we have, of course, an pre-molt. We have a kill spill, and this is a gizmo from Nukipedia from PXF kill spill. So thank you so much for Xavier for this wonderful gizmo. Then we have a bit of a grade, which is literally the same kind of fog that you saw before. Then we have yet another bit of a grade with a ramp on the top, because of course you want to keep his face a bit more visible. And again, don't forget that it's much easier to see these little details when you see the final comp. So of course I wouldn't have started doing these grades without looking at the final comp, just because I'm deconstructing it here. That's why it looks a bit different. We have a bit of a floor fog as well. Again, these are all matching the CG, so all these grades are with the same values of the CG fogs you saw. But of course, because I don't have a depth pass, I'm using ramps and I'm using radials with animation to actually make him look like he's part of that. So he goes in together with Thomas. Now Thomas is one of the last layers we rendered out. We kind of have, I'm going to just go into the middle here to show you the gun. So that's the gun. We shuffled out the logo. We then added some motion blur to it to match the scene and merged it, of course, where it should be. This was merged by several layers here. So we have a first layer. It's going to lower the exposure. A first layer that just gives you like a first pass at the logo. Then we have a second pass at the logo. And that, of course, all then after that, we have the PXF kill spill to remove all the spill suppression of the green screen. We then again have all the color corrections of the fog. The first fog color correction, the second fog color correction, and the lower fog color correction as well. Now, if I go to the last frame, or maybe not the last frame, but maybe in the middle here or something like that, maybe around here, so I can show you a little bit of what's going on here. So, as you can see, we have a roto here that is darkening the boots because the boots were a bit too bright. That was lowered. Again, it's easier to see if you look at the final comp as well. A bit of a fog, some more fog, some color correction using a radial on the top, and some final adjustments. Now we have also some file eroding happening in the color correction of the edges, some more fog on the floor, and then finally we pre-molt. Now there's some channel fixes here with some rotoscope, especially on the shoulder, especially on the knee here, and also on, where's the other roto? It's probably another place. Yeah, there you go. It's on the shoulder, I think. No, it's on the middle. There used to be a hole there. Now I remember. So these are some little last minute fixes to the roto, and this is how he looks ready for the comp. He then goes in into the scene. So I think in here he gets merged together with the other dude. Then these two go in here. Now we fixed a couple of edges here as well using some roto shapes, especially on certain areas. So for example, if you look at this area here, we're doing a color extension. So this is a color edge node, which you've seen on my other videos. And literally what this is doing is it's basically expanding the edges so that you can remove that white fringe, So when I look at the actual layer, you can kind of see that there's like a few moments where we have some white edges here. We have some white pixels. And these, of course, are all coming from the green screen, of course. The color edge allows me to basically remove that by using the shrink matte option. And that, of course, if I remove it, you'll see what I mean. If I zoom in here, you see basically making the edge, instead of having a whitish value, it actually, see that little fringe edge, it basically has the same color as the rest of the suit. Now, we had two different color edge settings for both the bottom and the top area. So the one on the top area was with different settings. So again, we fixed that and then we merged it. We then merged both of them together. So as you can see, if I disable these two color edges, you can kind of see that you get these kind of white fringes on the whole thing, which are not helpful at all. So now that that's all fixed, and including this dude here, now that it's all fixed, we have an auto crop, so we only have really what we need for him. And then, of course, that gets merged on top of the plate down here. Of course, if I look at through here, there's already a bunch of other soldiers that have been merged. Of course, he's only merged on the back there, you know, because he was one of the foreground elements. The other soldiers are literally normal kind of thing. We have the soldier here, we put the lens distortion, we basically mirror him and transform him as well, and pre-multiply them, put the fog pass, put the other fog pass, put a bit of color correction, put some more fog or color correction, some less saturation, and then pre-multiplication. Now, we did that for every single layer, as you can see here. Now, they went into a 3D system. See, all of them go into a 3D system. So if I go in here to my scene, you can kind of see that they have been positioned in the actual place in CG. We used to have the geometry here to know where we were, but if I look through the camera's perspective, you can kind of see that they're just like 3D cards in the actual 3D scene. And this was made because the majority of them were static. They were not moving. We shot them as static plates in Stiller Studios because we didn't have time to actually repeat the camera move. So we ended up animating the cards and animating the transform geo so that they would move in according to where they were moving, you know. So if I look at default setting here, I don't know if you're going to see that though. It's very hard for you to play back this, but yeah, can you see the cards moving? Yeah, I think you can see it, although it's always a bit tricky to show movement of cards inside the 3D system. Let's just wait for it to cache a bit here. Now, I know it's not the smoothest of playback, and this is really the OpenGL in Nuke it sucks, so it doesn't really work very well. But as you can see, we've moved the 3D cards with the same movement of the position where they were. So, like I said, they were 2D layers that wouldn't move, but then we moved them in cards. I hope you understand what I mean. Like, I know I might be confusing you a bit, but I think you get what I mean. So this, of course, gets rendered. Then the render, because, you know, like this is quite heavy. As you can see here, we have a huge setup. All of this is the B-roll people in cards. So that gets rendered. That gets rendered, and it gets rendered, and it kind of looks like this. We basically have a bunch of soldiers running through their lives everywhere. Now, this, of course, needs to be masked still. I'm going to show you that in a minute. So that goes in here, and then it just goes down here. We also have the shadows of the shoulders as well. Let's see here. So we basically have an pre-multiplication. We again have the fog passes for the soldiers on the back there as well, and then they get merged in. Now they get merged in, so you see we have the CG here, and then they get merged into its places. And of course, we still need to put the CG places on top because you see the soldiers. Of course, if I had access to deep compositing back then, this was 2015, if I could, I would have done the CG in deep compositing, and then I would have put the 3D cards in deep compositing. That would have been a lot easier. But I didn't have access to deep compositing back then. So what I had to do was I had to create all these masks for different objects using the object IDs. Basically using the object IDs, merging them together so that we can kind of like basically have the soldiers on top, and then the soldiers on top, and then basically certain objects in front of certain soldiers, so that everything would fit like it should. So as you can see here, if you wait a little bit more, just a second, we go back here. We have, of course, the light wrappings as well. And then as you can see, if you just wait a little bit more here, we get all the soldiers where they should be. Now, this guy is in the wrong place, but it doesn't matter. He's getting covered by the other one. But as you can see, all these soldiers are now in the correct place. So this guy is between the crate and the tank. These two are between the stuff. Like I said, if I had deep compositing, this would have been a lot easier. Then we have, they are merged there. Then we finally apply the distortion to the full CG. So the CG wouldn't have had distortion yet. Now, Back here, what we did when we put them on the 3D cards, I need to show you this because I didn't show you that. Every time we brought in a card here, a piece of a soldier that was been green screen, of course we had to undistort that soldier. So these lens distortion nodes here are basically unwarping the lens so that they can go into the 3D system and they are untouched. And of course, because they go into the 3D system, eventually they have to be distorted back. So now we have the soldiers, the CG, the explosion, the matte painting, everything distorted. And basically then we put some shadows on the floors. We then have some shadows for all the layers, and these are using some grade nodes here to basically fill in the shadow for this guy, the shadow for everyone, and they are coming from literally shadow passes that we have. So for example, give the example, this one here. So this is coming from the plate. What we did here was we did a luma key to try to extract the shadow. We did another luma key, which was a bit less harsh. We channel merged them both using a roto shape. Then we did a bit of a grade on the alpha channel. We reformatted it to the position where it should be. We then also blurred it ever so slightly, especially the S area here. We then channel merged it with a ramp and channel merged it again, cropped it so that it's only this area, and then this is now used on the top layer. So you see, that's where the guy should be. So now I have a merge, a grade node that is making the shadow, and this was done on every single shadow you see here. So every single shadow was placed. And then ultimately we did the same for Thomas Wall as well. It's the kind of same thing really here. We have his shadow. His shadow was, actually, we had a bit of a different situation with him. What we did was we picked up the green screen, we picked up the clean plate of him, retransformed them both to 2.5K, and then we used an additive keyer. So basically the additive keyer uses the background, and this is a note from Nukepedia as well. We use the background with an alpha channel. So this is the alpha channel of him. Gets eroded, so we have just that section. Goes into the edge input of the additive keyer. Now the additive keyer is also inputting it with the CG background, and that gives you kind of like the extra little bit of detail that we should have there. And that just gives you an additive keyer just at the bottom here together with a shadow. And of course the shadow was brought through here, which was literally picking up this area, going to a keyer to get a luma key for the shadow, gets channel merged with an alpha coming from a roto, and then goes into a merge node. This merge node, we're always using the lift in the multiply to merge it, putting a bit of a blue tint into the shadow to match it. And this is the light direction. And then finally, even before we place the actual soldiers, which are only coming here, we have some smoke layers. Now, these are smoke layers from Houdini. So this is a fog pass from Houdini. It was rendered at HD, by the way, because we wanted to save some time. Reformatted to 2.5K, which I know it's dirty as hell, but it doesn't matter. We unpre-multiply it because there is an alpha channel on it. We did color correct it all. We also added some grain just to make it more dusty, actually. I know it's a bit weird, but it did work. Sharpened it quite a bit. We added the lens distortion into it, and as you can see, the lens distortion just gave the bowing of the lens in the middle here so that the smoke looked like it was photographed. Put a bit of depth of field into it just so it would look okay. And then literally we merged it on top, and this was added on top of the whole thing just to give you more atmospherics. Once that's done, now we have all the people merged everywhere. We then have the shadows, and everything is merged everywhere. And now finally we can place the actual main actors with their own light wraps, of course, individual light wraps for them. Then we merged, edge blur them a little bit using an alpha channel coming from them. We bring in the alpha channel into a copy and then use that to just edge blur just the edges of them. So now there's not much left really. As you can see here, we only have the hash in the final comp here. So the hash was done from those 3D systems that I showed you. So we basically have some Houdini hash, which is coming from the back. I'm just going to gamma up so you can kind of see it. So this is basically CG rendered with an alpha matte of the geometry. Again, if I had deep compositing, I would have done it in deep compositing. We have some redshift depth, and that is basically being color corrected. Then we have even more particles coming in from Houdini as well. We grade them even more. We put some fog. We grade them even more. We do a pre-multiplication. Then, of course, we add the lens distortion into it so that it would work. We put a little bit of depth of field into it. We graded it. And, of course, this grade here, the last grade is a very important one, is basically the main character's alpha merging into this mask. And you can see that basically what I get is I get a silhouette of those particles with the main characters. And that finally gets merged on top. And so that you get all the particles. And again, if I had deep compositing, I could have had it in the front and on the back, but I didn't really have that. Then I have a bit of a weighted blur here. Basically, it's just like a color correction, an extreme color correction with a weighted blur, which is a gizmo, and then a bit of color correction again. It gets merged, and this just gives you a bit of diffusing in the scene, a bit of a crop. There's then a couple of color corrections, which will be changed anyway, because we're going to do a final color correction. Some lens tweaks, a little bit more color correction. We have a radial blur to do a vignetting, which I've graded to have pure white in the middle, so we don't have anything affected here. This gives me a bit of a vignette. Then I get a bounce light on the middle. We add a roto shape on the bottom here because we felt that we had too bright areas here, so we kind of darken it with a mask. Again, like I said, the color correction will happen later. We then have a bit of a sharpen node using a log to lin, and the sharpen node just gives you this kind of like nicer feeling to it. So if you look at his face here, you can kind of see that it just gives that extra sharpness to look like it's really nicely filmed. A little bit of a chromatic aberration, not much. You can kind of see it on the side here. Just lifts a little bit of the pixels and stretch them a little bit just to give it a little bit of color chromatic aberration. A completely creative option. It wasn't really necessary at all, but it kind of helps the scene. I have a bit of a clamp here just to make sure that we don't go completely overboard with the values. We have a grade node, and this is a Luma Pictures grade node. We weren't matching the grade from the plate. We did a completely creative grade, a creative grain. Sorry, I keep saying grain, I mean. We did a completely creative grain. And then I have like a grain from Luma Pictures. Again, this is not matching the grain from the plate at all, no. This is a completely creative grain that we placed in using manual methods. We could have photographed some grain. I'm not very fond of digital noise from a red camera, so I prefer to put stock of grain, and that's what I did here. And then that's it, like that's rendered, and that is now the final comp. Now, the final comp still was adjusted, because you see, this is the comp of 55, version 55, and version 51, and then we go into version 64, which is the final scenes, and as you can see, there's a huge amount of adjustments we did. We basically put the guys with more silhouetted. We basically merged so that color corrected them so we can actually see them better. They are more visible. We actually merged better. We removed this explosion, which was a bit ridiculous on the top here. We also added a bit of more depth of field to the whole thing so that we actually feel like it's a bit less visible. But especially these silhouettes are so much nicer. Before we just had a foggy mess and you could even see the guys. So on the final color correction, we actually added some fog. We actually added some color correction. So I love silhouettes. And of course, as you've seen on the beginning of this project, I was very fond of the work from Roger Deakins. So I wanted to kind of get that kind of sense of Jarhead. So, but let's go to the grade script to show you what I mean. This was the final comp script. And the only difference between the two of them really is that all these large areas here, all these large areas of CG compositing, all these large areas of sky matte painting rendering, because I wanted to make the script much more faster with a better performance, we ended up rendering sections. So you see, for example, here, so you see all these sections, which are the CG, were pre-rendered. And if I show you in the final comp, you see they're not even here. So that's what the color correction script really has. I'm going to close the comp itself, and then I'm going to jump into the final color correction script, which is literally a slimmed down version of the comp shot, really, just so that I could have it fast enough, because we did color correction together with Will Cole and Will O'Connor at Fire.Smoke. So we wanted to be as interactive as we could, so I wanted to have this script quite fast and quick, and still retain some of the layers that I could use for color correction. Then we went and did some color correction. I already showed you some of the reference we had. Of course, we had the game itself as a reference. Because, as you know, I work from my home office, Hugo's desk, but I wanted to do the grade with Will O'Connor, so I actually went to Fire.Smoke's office and set up shop on their main meeting room, and I brought my computer back then. I brought like a professional color correction monitor from Blackmagic. I brought some scopes, brought my RAID system, my Mac Pro, and we did a really nice session between myself, Will O'Connor, and Will Cole, and we finished the grade. And this is the final shot together with the graphics and After Effects from Fire.Smoke as well. This is the final grade, the final shot with everything. I know it's a bit dark, but believe me that it does look much better when you look at the 2.5K version in Vimeo. So if you watch it in Vimeo, you'll see that it looks much better than the version that you're watching now, because you're watching it, of course, a bit compressed. And here's the breakdown of the shot. This basically shows you kind of how we were done. I'll show you more in detail when we open the scripts and I'll open the 3D scenes, but as you can see, this was built up by using, first and foremost, the explosion. We had the explosion scene that was created in Houdini, the point cloud in Houdini, the matte painting from David Gibbons, then the CG from Redshift and all its compositing, the shadow elements, and then, of course, we had all the dust and all the people that were repeated. It's always the same 3 actors, and then Thomas Wall in the middle, plus the particles and the final smoke. This was made by several layers. As you can see, that this is the raw render from Redshift, just with the multiple EXR passes. This is the raw bomb. This is the raw particle system and the raw smoke system that we did in Houdini, and the particles were done on XSI using ice. And these were the green screen. We have Thomas on the top here. We then have all the soldiers that we used. We used different parts of their acting, always the 3 of them, and then we just repeated and scattered them through the set. Now, I don't need to reconstruct the whole shot again, because we've already done the whole shot, but I just wanted to show you some of the final color corrections we've made. So, like I said, this is the no fog render from the CG from the previous comp, and as you can see here, we still have object IDs, we still have the fog passes, and this is just to help me while I'm doing color correction live with clients and with Fire.Smoke at their office. I could still access certain parts of the script. I know it's very typical for people to color correct in DaVinci and bring in alpha channels, but I just hate that. I prefer to have full control of the scene. I want to make it as best as I can. So first off, we had, again, we adjusted the fog a little bit. So you've seen this already, but I just did some adjustments to the fog so I could make it a bit nicer with the silhouette, with the silhouetted soldiers. The same goes for the boxes here. The boxes are literally just a render that we did with the XRs. We still have the passes for them on the other CG. That gets comped in, there's not much happening here. It kind of got removed a bit later. That then goes in here to the matte painting. So we have the barrels lift. We also have the matte painting. So the matte painting was pre-rendered. And as you can see here, together with also the explosions as well. That entire scene you've already seen. I'm just going to go to the characters themselves. So the soldiers, we did a lot less to them. So because I pre-rendered them all. So you see here, these are the soldiers already kind of pre-made with then pre-multiplication. These are the other soldiers, the bottom soldier that we've rendered. Let me just go in here to the section where we placed them. So this is the comp. So we start by having the normal CG that you saw before. I then adjusted the fog. This was the Houdini render. We basically adjusted a little bit, and then we started just placing the people. Now, when we placed the people this time, we started using color correctors to make them more silhouetted. So you see here, they're much darker than on the other comp you saw, and that's really coming from some color correctors we did here. So I'm gonna just open this up a bit so you can see. So you see, if we give an example, these guys here, for example, these guys here, what we did here is we darkened them a lot more. We've tweaked the fog a lot more. And then once it goes in here, we basically unpremult them, and then we basically basically screen them with the fog, and then merge them on top with a color corrector and then a pre-molt, and then they become quite bright, of course. Then they get merged on top like so, but they were already merged before, and that of course gives me like just a little hint of atmospherics on top, and again now they're silhouetted as opposed to the non-silhouetted version that you saw before. And then it's kind of like the same again, basically merging one by one, putting all the masks, all the shadows on every single part, then of course adding the lens distortion, and then of course we had the final grade. There's still also the fog passes for the floor and for the foot that you saw before as well. We then adjusted, let's go back down here. We then finally merged the two characters. This time we darkened them quite a lot so that they were more silhouetted. We then have the debris as well. Same kind of deal. This was all the same. The difference really here is this color correction. We do a much more extreme color correction, really extreme color correction, to really pull down this basically silhouette. Then we grade it down a little bit because it was a bit too hot. We still lifted this side because it was a bit too dark here. And then we finally added even some more color correction, some vignetting to the scene, some middle vignetting, opposite vignetting, a bit of a gamma down on this side, a desaturation as well going on. The same stuff, the sharpen, the chromatic aberration, and the grain, the custom grain we've made. And that was really the final render. So of course this is very much an opinion thing, really. Like, I mean, maybe some people prefer the old, more dusty version, and some people maybe prefer this more silhouetted version. I kind of prefer the silhouetted version. The client also preferred that as well. Also Fire.Smoke preferred that as well. It made it much more gritty. It made it much more closer to Roger Deacon's work, and it also made it much closer to to this kind of war zone effect that we were trying to achieve. So I'm very happy with the grade, and like I said, you can definitely do all these grades in DaVinci. Yes, you can, but I just prefer to be inside of Nuke because then I can adjust anything I want. I have all the IDs, I have all the passes, I have all the shadows, and I have all the rotoscopes and all the keys. Literally, I have total control over the scene, and I think some people might be overwhelmed by that, by having too much control. But, oh boy, I really enjoy having a lot of control. I don't want to leave control in color correction because it's so easy for you to ruin a shot in color correction. So many of us, especially CG artists, know how difficult it is to maintain the integrity of shot during color correction, especially with clients involved. So that is it for the comp, really. Yeah, that was really the comp side of things. Then once the compositing was completely done for all the shots, we went to Nuke Studio and basically had, well, I mean, throughout the entire project, we always had Nuke Studio as the edit because it was like quite easy for us to version up. Of course, as you can see here, this is version 64 of the shot. You can't see the versions anymore because they're offline, of course, because this project has been archived. And when I archive projects, I only keep the last versions. So as you can see here, we have all the offlines. But we use Nuke Studio for all the editorial, and we also use it for the titles as well. The titles are basically After Effects animations that were done, and they are positioned in a title track here on Nuke Studio so that they have transparency and they're using the alpha channel. And then, of course, we have all the other shots. We've placed the final audio as well. and then it was exported. Now the final export was Apple ProRes 444 as the main master. We did several different edits. We had a Japanese version, we had an English version, we had a French version, we had a German version with all different voiceovers. They were all rendered out in Nuke Studio. And the master was 2.5K, but of course most of the edits were exported in HD for delivery for YouTube. And then the master of 2.5K was also posted on YouTube, but also posted on the game as well. And the way that this worked was really simple. We basically selected everything, went into the export. Of course, I don't have the template anymore because it's been a long time ago, but I do have a beginning of a template here. So of course we pointed into the path that we wanted to do. We then had a sequence version set up here for the actual timeline, so it would pick up the name of the version, because of course we had different sequences, a European version, a German version, so of course I wanted those names to be picked up by the name of the timeline. And then, it goes without saying that we just basically had a transcode of images here. The transcode was as Apple ProRes 444. It was the encoder of Move64. We didn't really change any setting whatsoever. We left the color space at default. By the way, default for Apple ProRes is Gamma 1.8, so that's what usually it comes out. Sometimes we do deliver in Rec 709, but this was for the web, so we did the default setting for Apple ProRes. Nothing else was changed really. We just included the effects because some shots we had slight tweaks on the color correction. And then that was it. One little trick I would say is that when you export this, I would always say that you should keep the Nuke script in case if the export crashes, at least you can open the Nuke script and actually re-render if you need to. Especially Nuke Studio can crash quite a lot. Once that's done, as you can see, the preview would be Homefront version 1. Then you press export and then it gets exported. Of course, I already have this exported, so I'm not going to export it for you. But let's go into Adobe Encoder, where we actually encoded the final version to deliver to the client. Then at the very end, once we had the Apple ProRes ready, this was of course the master, the UK version, which was 2560 by 1440 as a ProRes 444. This was about 8 gigs, so this is the final version with the maximum quality from the comps. This was used as our master. And now I'm going to just drag this into Adobe Encoder. Tend to use Adobe Encoder because it allows me to just have a bunch of videos with the same presets. I'm just going to really quickly, of course I don't have all the videos anymore, but just going to really quickly just show you the preset that we used. So first off, I would start with using the YouTube template. Since it's going to be delivered for YouTube, I'm going to keep the YouTube template for 4K. Of course, we're not delivering on 4K, we're delivering 2560, so I'm just going to type here 2560 and it would be 1440, which is the resolution of the actual file. We're doing 30 frames per second, which is the delivery of this specific project. I'm going to render at maximum depth so it has the maximum quality possible. I'm going to leave my encoding settings as they are because they are already preset for YouTube and this is not an HDR version. I'm going to leave variable 1 pass as well. 40 is usually what he does for the preset of a 4K film. Now, this is not a 4K film. It's like, 2.5K. But I'm still going to keep it 40. Why not? Like, a bit better quality anyway. It's always very important for you to send an H.264 to YouTube with enough quality for the encoding of YouTube to actually work fine. I never post very small files on YouTube because otherwise the re-encoding of YouTube might damage the file quite a lot. I'm going to put use maximum render quality so that any scaling that it does, anything that might be working would be done in maximum quality. It's estimating the file to be 720 megabytes, which is really good. On audio, though, I would change the quality, not change it, but I would make sure it's 320, just to make sure it has the maximum quality possible on sound. And I think that would be it, really. Now, if I press OK on this, I'm on a Mac, of course, so I have a choice of OpenCL or Metal because I have an AMD card. I'm going to use Metal because it's been going quite faster on encoding on Metal. And then I'm going to just press OK. As you can see, it starts encoding right away. It's quite quick to encode. Should really be giving me a thumbnail here. For some reason, it's not giving me a thumbnail. I'm not really sure why, but it does usually do that. But as you can see, it's using all my cores, almost, of course. I have 24 cores. It's kind of using 12 plus 6, kind of. Like it's, for some reason, the second core is just halfway through. I'm yet to see applications that really use all the cores except 3D applications, so I'm not really sure why they don't, but that's usually a common problem. So this took about 50 seconds to encode, and here's the actual version for MP4 that we had, which would be just the same thing, and it's roughly 700 megs for delivery. And then, of course, we just repeated this for all the versions from all the different languages. Now, at the end, of course, we're incredibly proud of this project, especially since this was probably one of the most successful projects I've ever been involved on. I was very lucky actually to earn quite a lot of awards on this project, which is always good. It always feels really well. It's very rewarding to the team. And especially I'm very proud to not only have won the California Underground Film Festival, we won also on the London Cinematic International Festival, on the Best Short competition. And especially we're really happy that we ended up earning 3 Telly Awards this year. One of them, of course, was for The Walking Dead, but was very proud to be among the Best Directors Awards. So both me and Will O'Connor won Best Director for Homefront The Revolution, and I also ended up earning Best Visual Effects Supervisor for Homefront The Revolution as well. So we're extremely proud of this project, of course.
Thank you so much for watching these series of videos. Please leave a comment and don't forget to join Hugo's desk so that you can join the conversation in Patreon. Hope you've enjoyed these videos. Thank you so much, and I'll see you around. Goodbye.